on our YouTube. Um, we record these, we post them on our YouTube. So if you ever want to look up Missouri Community Betterment on YouTube, we've got a nice little backlog of these really informative lunch and learns. I wanted to give everybody a chance to also introduce themselves. When we have you guys register for these meetings, we get a list of your names and your emails, but not necessarily which community you're from. So if you feel comfortable, if you would like to come off mute and introduce yourself and what community you're from, or drop that in the chat, we'd love to know where you're joining us from in the state. I can go first. My name's Elizabeth Anderson. I live in Jefferson City. I work for the University of Missouri Extension, and so I cover several counties in the East Central region. So I get to drive around a lot and see a lot of the state, which is really nice. Who wants to go next?
I'll go next. I'm Shelley Lovett. I am from Ridgeway. I am the president of Ridgeway Community Betterment Association. I'm also on the Ridgeway City Council. I am the school librarian, parents as teachers educator, and I'm teaching junior high ag this year.
Busy.
Yes.
My name's Adam Ratley. I am from Shelbina, and I'm just tuning in to learn to see what things we can look for our community.
My name is Sue Dial. I'm from Buffalo, Missouri, and I'm a volunteer with Economic Development, and I should be joined by Holly Elliott, our Economic Development Director, soon. She's actually working on a CBDG grant right now with our city administrator, so she's supposed to be tuning in at any time. Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm Diana Middleton. I'm from Ava, Missouri, and I'm recently retired. I moved here from Dallas, and I've gotten involved in a lot of nonprofits here and also with the city. And I don't know a lot about Missouri Betterment, so I'm really here to learn, what it's all about and how it can help us.
Hi, my name is Laura Crowfoot. I am also retired. I am the VP of our Canesville, Missouri, up in North Central Missouri area. As I indicated, I'm retired. I have lived all over. My husband is retired Air Force. However, I did spend approximately 30 years in the Kansas City area. So Missouri is more of I lived in this area than I did my home state of Iowa. I am very eager to know more about you guys.
I'm Terry Johnson. I am with Stanberry Community Betterment, and we also have a Main Street and are very interested in this type of grant and what's available to our community.
Charlie Vaughn. I'm in Aurora, Missouri, and I work with KSWM radio station.
I'll go. My name is Serena Anderson. I'm working with Monette Main Street here in Monette, and I've worked with CDBG funds in 2 other states before, so I'm really excited to see if I can bring some funding to our little town here.
I'm Jennifer Whitson. I'm from Steelville, Missouri, the center of the world, I'm sure. And we need to have a lot of ideas coming our way. So it's good to be here. And I am a board member, so it's good to see everybody on here. Thank you for showing up. I appreciate it too.
I know not everybody can come off mute. If any of you are curious about some of our other co-participants in this Zoom today. You can take a scroll through the chat and you can see folks from all over the state. But I'm going to give a couple of minutes that if anybody wanted to come off mute and introduce themselves, you are more than welcome to.
Andrew Murphy. I'm the Assistant Director for Ozark Foothills Regional Planning Commission. We cover 5 counties: Butler, Carter, Reynolds, Ripley, and Wayne, and the 16 incorporated cities in those communities in southeast Missouri.
Good morning. My name is Vanessa Frazier, and I'm from the Missouri Boot Hill, Executive Director of the Harville Community Betterment. And I'm trying to get my video on, so bear with me. I should be popping in here any minute now. We have low signals down here in the Boot Hill, so I'm working on my video.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. If you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself, we're going to keep moving forward a little bit, but you can always drop in the chat. I had mentioned right at the very beginning that when you all register for this, it tells us your name and what your email is, but not from what part of the state you're joining us. So if you wanted to share that, please feel free. We'd love to connect with you. To connect you a little bit more with Missouri Community Betterment, I can introduce some board members to you. So the next couple slides will help you put some names and faces together of the Missouri Community Betterment Board of Directors. Right now, our current president is Brett Dinkins out of St. Louis. Our vice president is John Robinson out of Caledonia. And our secretary is Jeff Corman out of Jefferson City. Then some of our other board members include Elaine Campbell, who is a past president, and Tanya Watson, who was our most recent president after her. And then Jennifer Whitson, who introduced herself on the call from Steelville, is another one of our board members. Well, if my cursor wants to agree with me. Okay, there we are. Then we have Diana Huxep from Louisiana, Missouri, Paul McCrae from Maysville, Missouri, and Emily Smith also from Steelville. And then that's me, Elizabeth Anderson. I live in Jeff City. I've got Lynn listed there because that was the first place I started working for MU Extension, was down in Osage County. A board member not pictured is Brenna Bontrager from Independence. And then we have 3 board assistants. We're lucky enough to have them help us keep moving this work forward. Cece Spink is our executive assistant. Darla Haig is our event planner, and Vicki Jones is our development associate. And I'm going to turn the time over now to our speaker, Brandon Jensen. He is going to tell us about the community development block grant.
I was trying to put you on speaker so you could at least listen.
Sorry, one second. We've got, we're going to have Brandon speak to us. He serves as the program manager for the state of Missouri's Community Development Block Grant Program, which is what everybody's wanting to hear about. His work includes ensuring compliance across all CDBG funding streams operated by the state of Missouri, as well as internal and external engagement opportunities to highlight the successes and opportunities offered by the CDBG program. Previously, he worked for the Southwest Missouri Council of Governments, providing economic development and long-range planning, as well as grant writing, administration services to member communities in a 10-county area. So, Brandon, I am going to turn the time over to you and take down my slides.
Right. And let me make sure.
It's all yours.
Here. Are you all able to see this? All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for letting me have about an hour of your time. Hopefully you all have some good lunches prepared. The one thing I realized when I agreed to be a presenter at a lunch and learn is that means that I don't get to eat lunch. So that was a little bit of a harsh reality, but I'm really excited to be here with you folks. a little bit about myself before I get into this, just so you can understand the depth of knowledge that you get when you work with the CDBG program. I've been the program manager with the Department of Economic Development for a little over 2 years. I've been with the program for 3. And as Elizabeth mentioned, before coming to the CDBG program, I actually worked as a grant writer and administrator for the Southwest Missouri Council of Governments. And in a 2 to 3 year period of time, was able to secure around $30 million in state and federal grants for the 10 county area. Many of those communities are on this call, actually. So it's great to see some familiar faces, but I'm just as excited for the folks I haven't had the chance to meet yet. So for today, I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what the CDBG program is. We're an interesting program in that we're one of the most flexible federal sources of funding in terms of what we can fund, but along with that comes some pretty complicated regulatory requirements that we help you through. So I want to walk through sort of the structure of the program so you can know what you're signing up for whenever you pursue a CDBG grant. But then we'll spend a majority of the time talking through the various funding opportunities that we have. So talking about the application categories, the types of things that we can fund, so that you can have a pretty broad idea of just how flexible our funds can be to help your community address their needs. And then the last bit of time, because I can promise you that nobody wants to listen to me speak for a full hour. So for the last portion of time, I'll actually open it up for Q&A, and then I'll ask for folks to share what their community needs are, and work through maybe 3 or 4 potential projects, help you understand what might be barriers, what your next steps would be, so that that can serve as guidance for your community, but then may also trigger some ideas for other folks on the call, and then wrap up with how you can get a hold of us to continue pursuing funds. So as an overview of the CDBG program, we've been in existence for 50 years. This is actually the 50th anniversary back in April of the CDBG program. And so we recently celebrated having impacted millions of residents in Missouri, distributed billions of dollars in grant funds. And I think it's important to note that we're a grant funding agency, so it's not a loan or anything like that. And we don't have match requirements. So that's something that's often very intriguing to communities, and I'll talk about that later on. But we've existed for 50 years as a federal program, and we're guided under a set of regulations in 24 CFR subpart I. That is legal speak for there's a section in the federal regulations that tell us how we have to run our program. So everything that we do here at the state level and that you would be doing at the local level have to comply with those federal regulations. Our funds come to the state of Missouri from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And it's allocated on a formula that HUD uses that looks at the number of dilapidated residential units we have in our state, the number of low to moderate income persons that we have, as well as our population growth or lag, as compared to the other 50 states. We are considered a non-entitlement program. So if you work with a community that has a population of 50,000 persons or more, or a county that has 200,000 persons or more, then you're considered an entitlement community and actually receive your funding directly from HUD and don't have to compete within our state program. So those communities are ineligible to apply for our funding. But if you're a community less than 50,000 in population or a county less than 200,000 in population, you would be considered eligible for our program. And that's really most of rural Missouri. So those funds come to us at the state, and then we take those funds. It's around $24 million annually that we receive, and then distribute them out through a series of application cycles, both competitive and open cycle. And I'll talk about those here in a bit. So I talked a little bit about eligible jurisdictions, and I covered this non-entitlement idea. So cities less than 50,000, counties less than 200,000. We include that full list of eligible or of communities that are entitlement and cannot apply for our funds at the beginning of each of our application guidelines. So we have guidelines for each cycle that we launch. So you can go to those, and if you're unsure if your community would qualify or not, if you're listed there, then you receive your funds directly and couldn't apply to our program. So once we know that you're a non-entitlement community, the next thing that we look at is your performance. So because our funds are such a competitive program, we really try to work with communities and make sure that they're receiving their funds and then carrying out the project in a timely manner. So if a community has a project that has been open, so was awarded more than 3 years ago, then we would not grant any new funds to that community until they complete that project and close it out. That's to make sure that we're getting funds to communities who can do stuff quickly, impact their community, and then move on to the next need that they have. The second ineligibility criteria, and this is directly from federal regulations, is if your community has a delinquent audit, or has an outstanding federal award expenditure request. And our office can check for the federal, for both of these criteria, if you're unsure if your community has failed in either of these areas. So our funding, as you can probably guess from this, flows directly to a city or county who is the applicant for a project. But we recognize that oftentimes it requires a partnership in your community to make something meaningful happen. So if there is a special district, like a road district or a water and sewer district in your community that's needing assistance, the city or county would apply and include that entity as a sub-applicant on the project. We've also seen several projects in partnership with nonprofits like senior centers or entities that may provide childcare services. And you can include them as a sub-applicant in your community's project to improve those facilities. But our funds have to flow directly to a city or county. So we'll enter into a grant agreement with the city or county, and then they'll have agreements in place if they have sub-applicants on who's going to be responsible for what. But in no case can our funds flow directly to an individual or to a business or to a nonprofit. So it always has to flow through the city or county. The last thing I want to talk about, and I touched on this briefly, is the program structure. So every 5 years, the state of Missouri has to complete what's called a consolidated plan. And it essentially says, here's how we're going to use our funds that we anticipate receiving over the next 5 years, and identify the types of projects we'll fund, and how we'll carry out the programs in terms of making awards, selecting projects, all of that, as well as the goals that we're hoping to achieve, and providing ourselves with performance measures so that we can remain accountable for the funds that we receive. That consolidated plan is built off of those federal regulations. So you can sort of think of this as a cake or a pyramid in terms of the regulations and the requirements that your community would be working with. So at the bottom, you have those Code of Federal Regulations and the state regulations. Those are things that neither you all nor myself can control. So these are the things we have to make sure that we're meeting on every single project that we fund. The next level is that consolidated plan, and then our annual action plan. So those are the things that the state writes in alignment with those federal and state regulations to say, here's how we're going to carry out the program. And so anything that you all do at the local level in terms of your projects have to align with those planning documents and the state and federal regulations. The next level is the state's policy and guidelines. So these are the things that my office writes to help give you all guidance on how to carry out your projects, and the things that our staff look to whenever they're working with your community to carry out a project. And then finally, we have the projects that you all are putting forward. So this is really where you all have the ability to interact with this program and make it work for your community. So you can tell as we go up this, there's increasing local control. And that's really important to us, and trying to be as flexible as possible, recognizing that each community has its own set of individual needs and barriers. And so we try to be as flexible as we can within all of those layers that come before those dollars reach the community level. So just an important thing to remember is that everything we do has to align from the bottom up. And the farther down you go, the harder it is for us to offer any flexibility. So whether it's assisting you with a project or when we're writing our consolidated plan and action plan, I would ask that you always provide us feedback about how we can be better structuring our programs to serve your community's needs. So that's all I'm going to talk about the structure. There's obviously a lot more that comes into a CDBG project, but I want to focus now on the high level categories and then walking you through some examples of eligible projects and some considerations that you might want to have if you're interested in that type of program. So this is going to be a really overwhelming table, and I'm going to walk you through all of it. But on the left-hand side, you can see all the different categories of funding that we have under our CDBG program. Each of them do have a maximum amount of funding that we can provide for the project. And it varies by the category you're looking at. But I think an important thing that I always try to highlight here is that these dollars, or the funding maximums that we identify, are for the maximum that we will award for your hard costs for a project. So we act as capital funding for any capital improvements. So think construction projects are the things that we fund rather than operational costs or anything like that. So these funding maximums are for your hard capital costs. That's your acquisition, your site clearance, your actual construction line items. But we recognize that there are costs that come above and beyond those actual construction dollars. So you'll have to have an architect or an engineer for your project. You'll have to have a construction inspector. You'll have to have a grant administrator who will walk you through the program. And each of those services comes with a cost. So our program will actually award funding for those costs above and beyond your funding maximum. So when we tell you that for community facilities, you can get up to $500,000, that's $500,000 that are actually going to make a change in your community. But then we can also step in above and beyond that for those ancillary services that are necessary for the program. The next thing I want to talk about is a national objective. So I'll explain what these are as we go along and as we move through these categories. But the most important thing to remember is that for every single CDBG project that we fund, the project has to meet what's called a national objective. And these are identified in the federal regulations, but 70% of our funds have to benefit low to moderate income residents. And so that's anywhere you see LMI, whether it says area or limited clientele after it. Those are projects that can qualify under that LMI national objective. The remaining 30% we can put towards slum and blight or urgent need. But obviously those funds are a lot more limited. So those programs can be a bit more competitive. The last thing I want to talk about on this slide before we move into talking about each of these categories independently is the application cycle. So the first three are part of one application cycle that we have each and every year. It is a competitive process. So we receive applications during a set period of time. After that application cycle closes, our staff review those applications to make sure they're complete and accurate. And then they go through a scoring process based off of evaluation criteria that are laid out in the application guidelines. So you can see exactly how we're going to be measuring your project. So then we take those prioritized projects and start funding at the top of the list until we've either awarded all of the projects or have exhausted our funding that we have for that year. So that's those first three, the community facilities, demolition, and general infrastructure. The remaining four applications are all open cycles. So they operate as a first come, first served based off of the funding that we have available. A couple of them have some unique criteria, the water, wastewater, and the emergency and long-term recovery that I'll talk about here in a bit. So community facilities is one of our most widely used programs that we have available. It has that maximum award amount of $500,000 or $5,000 per household within your service area. So for every project, you're going to identify whether it's a community-wide benefit or something that's serving a portion of your community. And then you use the number of households to calculate your maximum. As I noted, this is competitive. And the typical community facility national objective is low to moderate income area or limited clientele. So for area benefit, HUD actually publishes data that based off of census data calculates your community's LMI percentage. So what percent of your residents meet their definition of low to moderate income based off of their income limits. If your community by that census data indicates that at least 51% of your residents meet that income threshold, then your community is considered automatically eligible under the program. This data varies quite a bit, and it really depends on who's responding to those census surveys that come out every 10 years. So if a community doesn't meet that 51% LMI, we do provide an opportunity for you to do a local income survey if you believe that LMI percentage is incorrect. We can walk you through how to do a local income survey to basically contest that HUD data and allow us to grant under that area benefit. The limited clientele category is a little bit different. So this doesn't depend on income data, but rather looks at what you're proposing for your program. And if you have limited who can use that facility to those individuals who meet those income thresholds, or if it's designed to principally serve what HUD calls a vulnerable population, so folks that they presume to meet that LMI, then we can qualify you under limited clientele. An example of this is if you're working with a nonprofit that provides childcare services for low-income families. We can look at their income thresholds, and if they're at or below HUD's requirements, then it can meet the limited clientele project. Seniors, individuals over the age of 60 are a vulnerable population under HUD's definition. So we see many senior centers qualifying under this LMI limited clientele, so long as their bylaws or they have some adopted document that says we are only going to serve individuals over 60 years of age. So our staff have a lot of knowledge and experience about how to help your community document each of these national objectives for your project. But the types of things that community facilities can fund are really quite broad. So we fund the acquisition, the rehabilitation, and or the construction of any publicly owned property. So anything that's owned by the city or county that's applying, or that's owned by a nonprofit, can be assisted using CDBG funds. The one thing to note is that we cannot assist by federal regulation. We cannot assist a structure that's used for the general conduct of government. And HUD defines that as your city halls or your county courthouses. It is a really, I don't want to say frustrating regulation, but it is a pretty significant barrier because we recognize that oftentimes city halls or county courthouses are some really historic structures and important to your communities. But the only time we can assist or provide funding to improve those structures is to make the structure ADA accessible. But all other types of projects, whether it's a fire station or a police station or a senior center or a daycare, all of those are properties that we can fund and provide assistance to. And you can see some of those examples here. Community centers, we also see parks quite commonly qualify under the community facilities category. The only other costs that we're not able to fund are operational costs, as I noted before. So if we're funding a senior center, we can provide the funding for the capital improvements to build a facility, but then it'll be on that entity's, it'll be their responsibility to demonstrate how they'll be able to operate and maintain the facility once it's built. So I'm going to move on to the next category. And please be writing down notes. I can't see anything that's in the chat. So please be writing down notes and questions as we go along, and we can tackle them at the end. So the next category is general infrastructure. Again, this is that maximum of 500,000. It's a competitive application cycle. The national objective is that LMI area, or rather than limited clientele, this one can qualify under slum and blight. If you have infrastructure that is declared blighted by your local governing body, so that's your board of aldermen, your city council, your county commissioners, if that infrastructure is declared blighted, then we can provide assistance to make the necessary repairs. But remember that if you try and apply under that category, we have a much smaller amount of funds that we can provide under that national objective. The important thing to remember is that anything we fund under general infrastructure can't be the result of deferred maintenance. So this is the idea that we expect communities to be properly maintaining their infrastructure within the resources that they have available. And it certainly helps applications if we see that a community has recently passed a bond measure or taken some other step to repair and maintain their infrastructure. But it's just the need is greater than what they can fund with those resources. Then we step in to help. It does have to be publicly owned. So we've received questions about improving like doing electrical distribution improvements in partnership with a co-op. That wouldn't be eligible because it's not infrastructure that's owned and operated by the municipality or county or special district. So most commonly we see communities apply for street improvements, whether that's grading or actual repaving, sidewalk projects, stormwater drainage, really anything that's within the public right of way we can typically assist with. Our priorities, and these are laid out in the evaluation criteria, are to fund though, and this is a very competitive program, recognizing that pretty much every community has a need for improving their roads or expanding sidewalks. So the priorities that we lay out within the evaluation criteria are those projects that have a substantiated need for the infrastructure improvements. So if your narratives demonstrate that this sidewalk is what connects your entire community to the only elementary school in your community, then that really demonstrates that there's a very, very high need for that infrastructure to be improved. We also look at your operation and maintenance capacity. So what are your plans to maintain this infrastructure once we come in and repair it? The last thing we want to do is repave roads that with a solution that's going to provide 5 to 10 years of useful life, but then not see a plan for how the community will continue to maintain that infrastructure after that useful life has expired. We also look for projects that leverage other financing resources. So I noted this earlier, but under very few of our programs, and I'll specifically note the ones that do, but under most of our programs, there is no match requirement. So the way our funding works is we first expect you to identify your total project cost. And then we ask that you submit your financial statements for your community and the sub-applicant. And we look at how much cash on hand do you have available to commit to the project. We work with you all to understand where your fund balances are for the community, and understanding the need to have reserve funds and have funds held back. But if there's any unencumbered, unrestricted cash in the city or county's general fund, then we would generally expect those funds to be committed to the project before we step in. So you have your total project cost, and then we subtract out what amount of funding your community has available, and then we fund the gap. And for some communities, we look at your financial statements and we see you have $0 available to commit to this $500,000 project, and that's fine. In those cases, we can fully fund the project without a single local dollar coming into it. But again, we have to have that documentation that you don't have any other resources available before we step in. And then that last priority is the local capacity. So what is your ability to actually carry out the project and get it completed? So our last competitive cycle application category is demolition. So this is for basically the tearing down of vacant, dilapidated residential and commercial structures in your community, recognizing there's a lot of this in some of our small towns that can hold back properties from being redeveloped or being put to a productive use. So our maximum for this is $200,000 if you're only proposing to demolish residential properties, and then $300,000 if there's at least one commercial property included in the project. It is a competitive application cycle, just as a note. And this program can only qualify under elimination of slum and blight. So again, this requires your local governing, sorry about that. It requires your local governing body to declare these buildings dangerous according to your local ordinances. And so that can cause a bit of concern sometimes working with private property owners. But this is an opportunity to clear their property of blighting conditions. It allows the property to stay in private control. So it's assisting private property, and it stays under the ownership of that property owner without placing a tax lien or anything like that on the property. So it's true unrestricted grant funds to come in and eliminate that slum and blight in your community. Under this, we fund the actual demolition activity. We fund demolition inspection services. So you have to have someone on site monitoring the demolition to make sure it complies with state regulations. We require an asbestos inspection and abatement if any asbestos is found on the property. And we can cover the cost for those services as well as your administration. So you'll always have a grant administrator who's helping to walk you through these projects. Some special considerations for this category is that we can only address properties that can be documented vacant for the last 12 months. We typically do that with utility bills that show no usage on the property for a consecutive 12-month period. The reason they have to be vacant is that by federal regulation, if you tear down an occupied structure, one, you have to provide those tenants with relocation assistance, and then you also have to replace that demolished housing unit. So you can imagine between those two items, it significantly reduces the amount of properties you can demolish with a $200,000 cap. For commercial property owners, this is one of the few areas where a match is required, but since they're private beneficiaries benefiting directly from the program, for a commercial property, the property owner has to commit 20% of the estimated demolition cost from their own funds to the project. So showing that they have some skin in the game.
How's Jim doing?
For residential properties, we require $500 per property to be committed from the property owner or from some source other than CDBG. And those funds have to be committed at the time you apply. We recognize that these costs can be prohibitive sometimes for communities. So we've seen communities get pretty creative with how they raise these funds. Whether it's going to a local community foundation, building up a partnership of businesses that recognize the drag on the local economy that blight can have. Or even I've seen churches do really successful bake sales to raise the money to cover these match commitments. So while it is a match commitment per property, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the property owner, although that's the most common way. If that's a barrier, we've seen communities get pretty creative in overcoming that. As part of your application, you do have to identify the approximate cost of demolition for each structure. We have to have a clear title on the property. So it's important to make sure you're working with property owners that have resolved any liens or any title issues. And it requires a consent form from each property owner. If there's a lien holder, such as a bank that provided a loan for the acquisition of the property, they would also have to sign an owner consent form because they hold an interest in the property. So we don't want to demolish a property that someone holds an interest to but hasn't agreed to participate in the project. You'll create a map as part of your application, identifying all of the vacant or all of the dilapidated structures in your community, which ones are vacant, dilapidated, and then of those, how many you're proposing to demolish. The greater the amount of vacant and dilapidated structures you're proposing to demolish, the more competitively your project will score. We really like to come in and have as big of an impact as we can in a community, trying to remove as much blight at once as possible. Again, those application requirements are they have to be vacant for 12 months. We need color pictures, and pictures really tell a lot of the story whenever we're reviewing applications. So I would encourage you to include as many of those as you can. We have to have that consent form from all property owners at the time of application, and then that clear title is proof of ownership. So now we're going to move out of the competitive cycle, and I'm running a little slow. So I'm going to go through these a bit quicker to make sure we have time to talk through questions and answers. So we're moving into our 4 open cycle categories. Water, wastewater is probably the most complex process that we have to secure funding. But it's because we've set up a partnership with USDA Rural Development and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources to leverage all of our combined effort, all of our combined funding to address communities' needs. So this is a maximum amount of $750,000 or $5,000 per household, and we can offer some flexibility on that. This acts as a gap financing. So you first have to work with USDA or DNR to secure a funding package from them. That's typically a loan grant combo. And then the cost of the project beyond what they're able to provide in terms of financing, we step in as a grant for. So this is open cycle. It's really based off of your timing and working with one of those 2 other funding agencies. And the projects for water, wastewater have to qualify through that LMI area benefit, either by HUD census data or through that local income survey. You will work with one of those funding agencies, and then they'll indicate that you might qualify for CDBG. You'll prepare a proposal, and then that's reviewed by the Missouri Water and Wastewater Review Committee, affectionately known as the MUC Committee. I'll let you guess why that might be. And then we all take a look at the project and figure out how we can provide a financing structure that's acceptable for the community. It's only for publicly owned systems, so we can't assist private water or sewer districts that may have been developed for individual neighborhoods. And again, we act as that gap financing agency. some special considerations. These priorities are laid out in our in the proposal guidelines, but it really, we need to see a documented need beyond just wanting to extend water and sewer to an area. There needs to be a need or a critical gap in your system that we're stepping in to fund. We will only fund projects if your user rates are at least 2% of the median household income. So that's going back to that, making sure that you're that we're only assisting communities that have the resources to operate and maintain the infrastructure going forward. We also look at how you're leveraging funds, the design, whether you're proposing to regionalize the system, and how ready your project is to begin once the funding is secured. So emergency and long-term recovery, this is kind of the most squishy program we have, simply because it's left very broad so that we can help communities address any emergent issues at the time that they arise. So this typically qualifies under urgent need, meaning that the community will have to have declared a local emergency within the last 18 months of applying. And it has to alleviate conditions that are a serious and immediate threat to the health or welfare of the community. It can't be the result of deferred maintenance, and we can't just fund maintenance activities. So what we typically have seen under this is if a community experiences a winter storm event and they had some pretty serious debris cleanup and electrical line distribution issues, we can step in to rehang those lines to help clear up the debris. If there's a water main break, we can fund emergency repairs to sort of patch it together until you're able to secure financing for a longer term. We've also funded if you have a building that may have collapsed on your historic square or in your downtown, we can step in to clear up that debris and stabilize adjacent structures. We again act as a gap financing tool. So first, we expect your community to use any insurance proceeds that you might have, then using FEMA funding if this is in partnership with a federal disaster declaration, but that's not required, and then any local funding you have. So after you've explored all three of those, then we can step in to fill any gap that exists. Industrial infrastructure, moving into our economic development application cycles. This is to fund any public infrastructure that's necessary to support a business expansion or opening in your community. For existing companies, it's a maximum of $2 million or $20,000 per job they're going to create. It qualifies under that job creation. So the one concern that I often see is that it requires a specific business to be a part of the project, and they have to say, we could not expand or open our facility unless these public improvements are made. And then they have to commit to creating a certain number of jobs within 2 years of the project being completed. If those jobs aren't created, then the project cannot meet a national objective, and those funds have to be repaid back to the state. So I oftentimes see communities or businesses get nervous about this clawback provision. But I'll just note that in the 3 years I've been with the program, we have closed many of these projects and not one of them have required funds to be repaid. So we see businesses able to meet the job creation amounts that they commit to. This is designed strictly for manufacturing and industry types of businesses. And it does have a 15% match that's required from the city or county. So for those public improvements, the city or county has to pay 15% of that cost. We can waive that requirement based off of certain financial conditions, but it's best to assume that you'll have to commit those funds up front. Additionally, it does require a dollar for dollar capital investment from the business. So if we're providing $2 million for public infrastructure, they have to be investing at least $2 million in their facility. The last program that we have is downtown revitalization. So this is open cycle. It's the newest one that we've operated, and it's actually the reason I came to CDBG was to rebuild this program. And so I'm incredibly excited that we launched it last November. It qualifies under elimination of slum and blight. So it's designed to address any private commercial structures in a target area that you identify to correct any code violations. So whether that's facade improvements, roof work improvements to any system or building wide systems like HVAC or electrical. It's really broad in terms of what we can fund, but it's really intended to be a catalytic investment into a few properties in your downtown, bringing them up to code, giving them a facelift so that you can hopefully trigger additional private activity in the surrounding area. We can fund infrastructure under this, but it has to be specifically downtown oriented. So parking improvements, streetscape improvements, things that are really going to help bring the downtown area back to life. And we have not yet funded any projects out of this. We have funds for between 3 and 4 projects right now. So if you're interested in this, we expect it to be highly competitive. So reach out to us. So this is just an overview of the funding that we have available for this year and the number of projects we anticipate being able to award under each cycle. So under economic development, up to 4 projects between industrial infrastructure and downtown revitalization. You can see 25 projects under our competitive program, 8 underwater wastewater, and then up to 3 emergency or long-term recovery projects. So we've got 8 minutes left. I apologize. But I want to stop here, see if there are any questions or any project ideas that folks want to workshop.
Right now, the only question that we have in the chat is just asking about when this recorded video will be available. And usually within a week or 2, it's up on our YouTube.
Brandon, I have a question. This is Diana.
Yeah.
We just recently redid our square and made it all ADA compliant, put in, the streetscape looks a whole lot better, the trees and all of that, improved the gazebo. But what has not been done is the individual buildings. A few of the owners have had the funds to say repoint all their brick and redo the interior, open the building as something new. There are several people, owners that want to do that and just don't have the funds. So we also have some damage from, like tornadoes in the past or, hail. And these owners just don't have the money for one reason or another to really bring these buildings up to spec. I mean, it's our downtown and it's old. And would that be the type of project that you're talking about as far as revitalization for the downtown area?
Yeah, well, I'll say our downtowns have certainly seen a lot through their years. So I don't think yours is alone in some of the challenges it's facing. And it's great to hear some of the investment that you're already making in your downtown area. That's one of the evaluation criteria for the downtown revitalization program is what you've done so far to try and assist it. But what you're describing is almost exactly what our funding is hoping to do. So you would identify a target area and we would expect you to address as many of the structures within that target area as you can. So I'd recommend maybe one face of your downtown square, one side, or a portion of it. So you can be really, really targeted. And then we have a maximum of $75,000 per structure, and that's an average. So if you have one structure that only requires $5,000 of work, but another that requires 150, we look at the average across all of the structures participating. But as I noted, it's slum and blight, so it would require your local officials to declare those properties as dangerous buildings. So that can sometimes be a concern for property owners.
Yeah.
But again, we step in with that financing to help address all of those blighting conditions. So as part of your application, you'll identify your target area, do a building inventory to identify what all of the blighting conditions are. And then that's what you would fund, is to make those repairs.
So blight is just considered, the definition of blight in this case would be that it's dangerous.
It's whatever is on your local books. Each community has a little bit different definition of blight and dangerous buildings. But it typically requires an inspection from your city building inspector, and then an administrative hearing process.
Got it. Okay.
This is Laura Crowfoot up in Canesville. Got a question
Hi.
on the downtown revitalization. I really appreciate everything you've given to us so far today. A lot to give us in just 1 hour's time. So greatly appreciate you sliding through this fast. On the slum and blight issue, does the city have to come up with part of the funds for this?
For downtown revitalization?
Right. Like we've got some buildings that are falling in. And the problem is that one of the buildings is a major danger zone to the community because one whole side has collapsed, the roof has collapsed. And when we ask the person about when are you going to tear it down, they tell us it's none of our business. And the problem is that person is on the city payroll.
Oh.
So we're kind of at a
okay. That presents a number of questions. I would say the first is depending on when that building collapsed, you could consider an emergency application to clear out the debris and stabilize adjacent structures. With it being owned by a city employee, that opens up the possibility of a conflict of interest. And so it doesn't prevent it from happening, but there's a few extra steps that you would have to take. And I'd ask you to connect with us offline.
okay.
But then for downtown revitalization, there is a requirement from the property owners or that match commitment. I can't remember the exact amount offhand. But that is also something that we're able to waive depending on the city and the beneficiary or the property owner's financial capacity.
Okay. So basically, if let's say it was going to cost $75,000 to tear down 2 of these buildings and to make the other building stable, does the city have to have part of that money in hand before we can apply for the grant?
Yes, any funding that's proposed to go towards the project has to be committed at the time of application.
Okay. All right.
I'm pulling up.
And that's where we run into the problems because our little town has nothing. So, okay.
Right. And like I said, if you look at your finances and you determine that you have $0 you can commit to the project, then that is absolutely acceptable, so long as you can document it.
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you, Brandon.
Yes.
Brandon, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I also have a question regarding this. I'm Terry from Stanberry, and we have an old theater building that has partially collapsed in the back and the roof is collapsed in, but we believe that the facade of the building is probably structurally sound.
Mm-hmm.
Could we do something like this to pull down the rest of the building so that we could still use the front of the facade and then do something?
And you actually bring up something that I neglected to mention. So under downtown revitalization, you can choose to do that target area approach. Or if you have a singular structure in your community that is like this is your cultural or historic heritage and that building needs to be preserved, you can apply as an iconic structure and allow that full $750,000 to go to that single structure. We'll ask you to provide some narrative and documentation demonstrating the local importance of that building. But what you're describing would seem to be a really good project to qualify as an iconic structure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's important to note is that whatever properties we assist, they have to be code compliant at the end of the project. Regardless of whether our funding is sufficient to cover all of the cost, and that additional amount, if it goes beyond $750,000, that additional amount would count towards the match requirement. But any structure assisted does have to be completely code compliant, and that's to demonstrate that you've eliminated the slum and blight.
Brandon, this is Diana again. We have so many things going on here that we need help with. But one that is kind of very personal to me is I'm not originally from here. And when I moved here, I was fascinated by the historic buildings. And we are having just a tremendous problem with, again, and I'm talking mostly about the draft stone buildings. We just recently lost one that I belong to the Ava Citizens Action League. I'm on the board, and we tried to buy it to build a welcome to Ava Center, and they wouldn't even sell it. And it was a historic building, and they tore the whole thing down. So obviously the city is not focusing on this. So we have a nonprofit that is trying to do so. So I can think of at least 3 buildings right now that are in various stages of deterioration that are all the stone, from like the 30s. Is there something that will, and obviously they're very iconic, they're unique to this area. Is there anything that we can do if the owners agree to help to restore those homes? And not only are they historic, but we also have a housing shortage here. So, if people can live in them, 2 of them right now are you can't live in them.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that the downtown revitalization program will require a really strong relationship between the city, any nonprofit participating, and the property owners. It requires really strong communication and coordination. That will be important for any program. But the second item I would note is that we cannot assist residential structures.
Okay.
And that includes if it's a mixed use structure in your downtown, so first floor commercial and then lofts above, we can still assist that property, but we can't make any repairs that benefit solely the residential portion of the building. So
these homes that I'm talking about, these are throughout the city. They're not downtown. Do you have any kind of program that will address, the other parts of the city?
The only program that I could offer, and you're going to hate that I say it, is our demolition program.
Yeah, we're not going to do that.
Right. So, that'd be the only thing that we could offer at this time. But I'll say we're a little bit over time. So I want to just thank everybody for the project ideas. I've got up here the way to reach out to us. So this is our main line. You'll get Monica. She's an absolutely fantastic person if you call us. And then this email goes to all of our project development staff. So somebody will reach out to you and likely set up a time if there's a specific project you want to talk through. But I just appreciate everybody taking the time to meet with me today. And Cece, I will pass it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
Thanks, Brandon. We really appreciate you being here with us. And if anybody needs the slides, I know that Brandon had also sent them along. So you can reach out to Cece. I know she's got a copy of it. Some of the ways to stay in touch with us and contact us are up here on the screen. Our website, there is a contact button there that excuse me, will send an email to the Missouri Community Betterment email. Also, that phone number, and then there's our YouTube, our Facebook, and our Twitter that you can use to keep track of what we're up to or what other opportunities we want to share. Additionally, we always have our lunch and learn dates. These are some of the upcoming dates in September. October is a little tentative because we have our annual conference coming up, and I'll describe that a little bit more in a couple of slides. So keep an eye out for those. We also have the Missouri MCB Better Together Fund, which helps us to provide this kind of content and keep it going into the future perpetually. There's a little QR code here if you wanted to scan that, where you can get some more information. And then, like I said, our annual conference will be October 21st. It'll be here in Jeff City at the big Missouri Farm Bureau building. Registration is open until October 14th. It's $60 for adults, $30 for youth, and you can email darlamcb8@gmail.com for more info. Thank you guys so much for joining us today.